Rebuilding our societies, the rise of populism and identity crisis in modern Western societies has disrupted our democracies. The traumatic terror attacks in Paris in recent years have left deep scars, but we commonly underestimate our own resilience. In this session, we're going to hear from a survivor of the Paris Bataclan attack and a journalist who covered the tragedy. First up from Paris, David Fritz Goeppinger is a Franco-Chilean author and photographer. He's one of the survivors of the November 13 Bataclan terror attack in Paris. He was taken hostage by 2 of the 3 attackers, I think for several hours. And in 2020, he published Un jour dans notre vie, a book about his traumatic experience and his life since. Let's hear the video from David Fritz first, and then I'll introduce Charles, our journalist.
Je m'appelle David Fritz Goeppinger, j'habite à Paris et j'ai 30 ans. Je suis photographe et auteur. Le 13 novembre 2015, j'ai été victime de l'attentat contre le Bataclan. J'ai été pris en otage par 2 des 3 auteurs de l'attentat et passé 2h30 malheureusement à leur côté. J'en suis sorti indemne, physiquement, mais traumatisé psychologiquement. Le 14 novembre 2015 commençait une seconde partie de ma vie. Comme si une partie de mon existence était arrêtée le 13 novembre et qu'à partir du lendemain, il fallait que je commence à gravir une espèce de grande montagne face à laquelle j'étais tout seul et où malheureusement la souffrance était présente tous les jours. Ça a duré plusieurs années et ça continue de durer aujourd'hui. Au fil de ma reconstruction, il y a eu beaucoup de rencontres et de personnes qui m'ont aidé. Si on peut parler chronologiquement, on peut parler aussi par exemple des hommes de la BRI, qui sont les hommes qui m'ont délivré ce soir-là. C'est les policiers, forces spéciales, spécialisées dans l'intervention dans le cadre du terrorisme et de ce qu'ils appellent l'anti-gang. Normalement, on n'est pas censé rencontrer ces hommes-là, c'est un cercle assez fermé, mais j'ai eu la chance de les rencontrer plusieurs semaines après. Et c'est tissé entre nous un lien indéfectible d'amitié et qui a duré, qui continue de durer aujourd'hui. Au fil du temps, il y a eu aussi d'autres rencontres comme les ex-otages qui étaient avec moi ce soir-là et avec qui j'étais, on peut dire aussi. Et bien sûr, ma psychologue qui m'a longtemps aidé, longtemps accompagné et qui m'aidait à comprendre ce qui m'arrivait et à mettre des mots en fait sur ma douleur et ma souffrance. Avec au bout de tout ça aussi une présence la plus importante qui est celle de mon épouse qui m'a accompagné au quotidien et qui m'a soutenu en fait depuis le 13 novembre. Depuis le 8 septembre 2021, le procès des attentats s'est ouvert à l'île de la Cité, au palais de justice de Paris. Et étant victime, je suis considéré comme partie civile. Tout d'abord pour comprendre ma position dans l'événement qui est le procès des attentats, il faut aussi comprendre le fait que je ne comprenais pas, je n'avais pas d'idée, tout ça était très abstrait pour moi parce que j'ai à peine 30 ans et la justice, l'appareil judiciaire français m'était un peu sombre. Et jusqu'ici, les accusés, par exemple, c'était des gens très lointains, donc, que j'avais jamais vus en vrai parce que les personnes qui m'ont pris en otage sont décédées aujourd'hui. Et donc, j'avais du mal à imaginer ce à quoi j'allais, ce que j'allais vivre en fait à partir du 8 septembre. Pour comprendre et pour mieux vivre cette période difficile qu'est le procès, j'avais imaginé il y a 1 an avec en compagnie d'une journaliste qui s'appelle Gaëlle Joly qui travaille pour France Info, une collaboration et on s'était lancé une idée de se dire bon si je peux travailler avec vous, voilà on a posé les bases d'une collaboration sans vraiment trop comprendre ce que c'était. Et j'ai vite proposé l'idée d'un journal de bord, donc écrit et photographique, parce que je suis photographe et j'écris, je suis écrivain aussi, j'ai écrit un livre qui m'a donné comme une base de connaissances pour raconter les choses. Et donc depuis le 8 septembre, je tiens un journal de bord quotidien pour France Info, que vous pouvez retrouver sur le site franceinfo.fr. Et je livre tous les jours mes impressions sur l'audience, sur ma fluctuation aussi de l'humeur, de comment est-ce que je me sens, est-ce qu'aujourd'hui je suis plus stressé qu'hier, pourquoi, qu'est-ce que tout cela me fait en fait. Et c'est important de savoir et de comprendre ce que tout cela nous fait, parce qu'en tant que victime, on est au même titre que les accusés, et pas au même niveau, mais On est au cœur de tout cela et on a vécu quelque chose qu'on n'a jamais demandé à vivre. Et là, la justice se penche enfin sur la mémoire, sur nos douleurs et sur tout ce qui a assombri Paris ce soir-là. Au départ, le procès, c'était beaucoup de questions. À l'arrivée, on se disait qui sont ces gens-là, pourquoi ils ont fait ça, etc. Donc, au fil du temps, là, ça fait plus de 4 mois que ça a débuté. J'avoue ne pas forcément avoir de réponse, mais je commence à avoir des réponses sur mes propres analyses personnelles, sur ce que j'ai vécu sur le Bataclan, ce que j'ai entendu, ce que j'ai vu, etc., qui sont corroborés par des témoignages d'autres victimes, mais aussi des éléments qui sont versés, ce qu'on appelle au dossier. Le dossier, c'est l'enquête. Donc, je pense que la mémoire et la reconstruction de ma personne en tant que partie civile, en tant que victime, elle est en jeu en ce moment, et surtout la reconstruction de la société. La société, elle va aller se reconstruire à travers des piliers qui sont par exemple les avocats de la défense. Les avocats de la défense représentent l'état de droit, représentent la France, représentent ce que ce soir-là on a voulu détruire. Et les avocats des parties civiles aussi, la Cour, le président de la Cour, et tous ces acteurs-là participent à la reconstruction et à l'élaboration d'une mémoire collective et une restructuration de la société après l'événement traumatique qu'est le 13 novembre.
An incredible story of resilience and I guess embarking on a process that takes so long. Let me introduce to you our next speaker. Charles Miranda is an award-winning senior journalist and author, currently defence and foreign correspondent for News Corp's national newspapers. He's worked for News Corp for almost 30 years, including as a Canberra-based reporter and bureau chief, as well as managing editor for the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph and the Sportsman. During his career, he's spent the past 10 years as European and Middle East correspondent and has covered frontline global coups, conflicts and natural disasters from Asia to Afghanistan. Charles, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
First of all, before I get you to respond to that amazing video from David Fritz, how did you end up reporting on the attack? And what sort of impact did it have on you? Because he has described so eloquently the impact on a survivor. But, you know, we often forget that you reporters are human beings in the midst of these incredible tragedies as well. So how did you end up there? And how did you survive that?
I was based in Europe, based in London as the European correspondent. And it's one of those jobs, you do everything. You do everything and anything. And up until that point, I think I started there off and on 2007 full time. You could literally end up being anywhere and doing anything. And I remember, wearing top hat and tails and having crustless cucumber sandwiches at Buckingham Palace. And 3 days later, I'm climbing a mountain and I came across the cockpit for MH17, which had been shot down by a Russian Buk missile. And no one had been to that site yet. And so you were suddenly there seeing a cockpit and everything that would come with that tragedy. So there's this great juxtaposed sort of career. And I guess I was in Turkey. And I was about to do the G20. In fact, I was checking into the hotel and I just got in my room and there was all these great delights, not Turkish delights, but wines and cheeses and things. And I turned the TV on and they said there's some sort of attack in Paris. We were there for the G20 leaders meeting. It was going to be a massive showdown between Obama and Putin. It was going to be an important summit. But I ran out of the hotel, literally didn't take anything with me, ran out, went straight to the airport and got the last plane out to go to Paris. And there was a direct flight. Why there's a direct flight?
So how long after the actual attack did you arrive there?
The attack, I arrived in the early AMs of the night before. So we know the attack was an overnight attack. So I literally saw it overnight, got there the next morning. And I remember one of the first things that struck me was the wailing of sirens. And I was like, constant, and everywhere. And then it would sort of die down and it would start again. You're like, what's going on here? And you realise they were doing raids. It was far from over. The bad guys were still at large. And I think there was something like 150 raids in those first few days as the story was evolving, and no one really knew what was going on. Well, hang on, there was a shooting here, and there was a bombing here, and something happened at the stadium.
Three different places.
And Bataclan,
right.
and it was 3 defined areas, but there was also everything in between because there was indiscriminate fire. So shop windows were blasted, and was that a target? Was anyone died there?
And of course, France was in part on alert because it was not so long after the Charlie Hebdo attacks.
That's right.
It was the beginning of this whole sort of season of attacks. Let's remind people that I think 90 people died in the Bataclan attack, which occurred at a rock concert in this Bataclan theatre. How did you think that affected the psyche of people? And since I know you stayed on and reported about Europe and France included, how did they rebuild from that moment?
It was a very interesting reaction, and having covered Charlie Hebdo terror attack in January of that year.
It was a different reaction, wasn't it?
Very different. It was very much a defiance. You know, we're marching on the streets, and 1.6 million people took to the streets and protested what had taken place, you know, in our country. Now, fast forward, and the Paris attacks were. It shocked. I think it affected so many people, and it was so personal. It wasn't just an attack on those 3 areas. It was an attack on a culture. It was an attack on a people. It was an attack on a way of life. And so it was less defiance when the stay-at-home orders, ironically, like now at COVID, there was stay-at-home orders, stay out of the city, and people defied that.
State of emergency.
They defied it less out of defiance and more because it was a shared pain. And I think the people of Paris wanted to come out and say, this has pained us all. And I remember one thing, and it wasn't an isolated incident, and I would see it so often, and particularly in Nice as well, for the attacks that happened after. And you'd be at traffic lights, and you'd see this thing, you know, someone's shoulders going up and down, and you realise the person in front of me is crying. And this could be, days later, weeks later. And there was no need for conversation. There was no need to ask, is everything all right? What's happened? You just see these hands come out at the traffic lights while we're waiting to cross. These arms would come across from everywhere and just sit on the shoulders. And that was it, and just reassured. No words were spoken. And then the green man would come up and we'd all cross the road.
So it was like a collective trauma.
It really was. And people didn't need to ask the question. People had all suffered to various degrees. Correct.
Yeah, there was no need to say what's wrong.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So interesting how David says the process of the trial and the witness statements are so important to him because they build this collective memory and it clearly is helping him. Do you think the process of the trial has helped France overall?
I think immensely. I think it was very much an outpouring. I mean, everyone knows the stories, but then to hear that level of detail from the survivors and what they went through provided another dimension to the healing process. They're almost inspirational. I don't like to use that, I don't use it lightly, but you look at someone who's staring down their attacker, staring down their tormentor, and giving evidence. That was very powerful for not just France, but some 50 nations who had victims, survivors, and or other involved directly with that assault.
Did it unify France, or were there differing opinions about what had happened?
I think it unified France, and I make 2 points on that. Hebdo was very different. It was a very small satirical magazine, which a lot of people didn't actually read, to be honest. There was only a couple of thousand sales. This was such a broad collective that it was, we must stand up to it. So while they didn't have the great marches and all the rest of it, it was still very much, we stay together, we'll stick together. And I remember when they had the minute silence and everyone just stopped in the street, cars stopped, people stopped. I mean, we're talking Paris here, right? It doesn't stop for anything and anyone. You try to cross the road, they all stopped. And it was kind of like, yeah, we're all feeling this and we're all going to get through this together.
How do you think a nation comes back after that kind of shock?
Look, I think they introvertly, they look at how they got to that point. You know, how did we get here? What's the cause of it? Paris particularly, but France is very multicultural nation, as you know. But no one put it against a certain faith or a certain ethnic person. It was very much, yes, we're there. And I remember there was a Muslim woman, Nijab, and she was praying at one of the sites where there was dead, and there was no animosity whatsoever. And in fact, she burst into tears and she was hugged. And some of the victims were Muslim. And of course, this was done in the name of faith. Some of their own faith got caught up in that directly. There was no animosity. I think it did bring people together.
Charles Miranda of News Corp, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.